Um, I don't want to keep you guys obviously so late tonight. So we might still have a few that sign in. We might see Ryan pop on at some point. He said he was going to try to join us tonight. So I was just kind of mentioning, we're really excited to start to offer a few new classes virtually to dive in deeper into some regions we think is really fun. We want to talk about the philosophy of the individual villages of Burgundy, as well as really focusing on the producers, because Burgundy is such an intimate region to know the producers so that you can really get what you want. I was kind of thinking about this, like it's one of the facts of life that good Burgundy costs money. I think we always talk about getting to know wine better so we can spend less money. And that is possible when we get to know the producers of Burgundy and we realize that they might be declassifying certain Grand Cru, Premier Cru, or, village sites to their Bourgogne wine or things like that. But the fact of life is Burgundy equals money, right? But since Burgundy equals money, we understand and we get to know producers and site so that we can mitigate the risk that comes along sometimes with spending money on Burgundy. So really what we'll do today is have a big focus on these producers. We'll have a big focus. This is the most Grand Cru focused class that we'll do during this sort of spotlight series because Gevrey has 9 Grand Crus. So there aren't any other that have quite so many Grand Crus. We're going to talk about the top couple of four or so Premier Crus, but these slides are going to be pretty dense, just so that you can be aware of that going into it. And the purpose of that is not to overwhelm you with all of this kind of technical information during this class, but so that when we send out the outline, you actually have that as a reference. I think it will be really fun. And tomorrow too, I'll follow up with a lot of the resources that I use to put this particular class together. And I really could have used another month to do this. There's just so much information. But I think, it's important to understand, Ryan and I are not Burgundy experts. There's a lot of those in the world, some of the best. Alan Meadows is fantastic. Jasper Morris does great things. Charles Curtis. There's so many, Burgundy enthusiasts and educators out there. What I really hope that we can do with this particular class is provide the context and the framework for you to also begin to learn more on your own and to explore, to make you more comfortable with kind of understanding how to dive deeper into Burgundy, because I think that that's an obstacle for a lot of people, that we have this region called Burgundy. We essentially talk about 2 grape varieties, but then you have to know vintages and then you have to know producers. Producer is more important than vintage because, as Provence says, and I've repeated this many times, so I know you've heard it, anybody can make a great wine or should be able to make a great wine in a great vintage, but it takes a truly skilled winemaker to make a great wine in a bad vintage. And, in Burgundy, there are a lot of weather conditions that are not necessarily always perfect. So let's look at these producers. So please feel free, of course, as as always, just interrupt me, use the chat box. I've never been to Burgundy, and this is terrible. This is terrible, right? Maybe it's not so terrible, but just because I want to go, I can't wait to travel. We've done a few classes on France recently, and it just makes me get that sort of travel bug and wish that I had the opportunity to go to some of these places soon, which I hope will happen. So we're focusing on 4 villages coming up, starting with Gevrey-Chambertin in the northern part of the Côte d'Or, in the Côte de Nuits. So we're primarily going to be talking about Pinot Noir. In this class, entirely about Pinot Noir. So let's orient ourselves first, right? Where are we? We're in France. We're in the sort of central eastern part of France, in this small purple region here. Now, Burgundy collectively does include Chablis, here in the north, which focuses entirely on white wine from Chardonnay. The Côte d'Or, which we'll talk about here, meaning golden slope. And then Beaujolais, which is an enclave, almost a monoculture for the Gamay grape, which is used to be planted in the northern part in the Côte d'Or for quite some time, but had been almost entirely removed into the region of Beaujolais. And this is really more of a political boundary, because the actual grape varieties, the philosophies around making wine, and even some of the climate and the soil especially, is very different between the Côte d'Or and between Beaujolais. But it is collectively considered to be part of Burgundy. We're not going to focus on that in this series. So let's spotlight in a little bit more. I've been waiting all week to use that joke, just so you know. All right, so we looked at a map of France. We understand where we're at. It's a fairly continental climate. We're going to focus a little bit more on what that does in a few moments. We're in the northern part of this area known as the Côte d'Or, as I mentioned, or the Golden Slope. This region is called the Côte de Nuits. And the Côte de Nuits is focused primarily on red wine. We do make rosé wine and we do make white wine from the region, but not all villages are authorized to make all three styles. Today we're talking about Gevrey-Chambertin, which is a village that's only authorized if you're going to use the village name on your label of wine. It can only be red wine from Pinot Noir. You will never find a white Gevrey-Chambertin. This dates back to the 1930s. So we're in this village here, and you can see the swath of Grand Cru vineyards that we begin to see in Gevrey-Chambertin that sort of go all the way down through Maurice Saint-Denis and then Chambol-Musigny before we skip and just see some Premier Cru vineyards, and then we'll move into Rougeot, Vosne-Romanée, which we'll talk about. We're going to hit up in terms of the villages over the next couple of weeks: Maurice Saint-Denis, Chambol-Musigny, and Vosne-Romanée. So let's go in a little bit more. So you can see the city of Gevrey, which is to the more northern side, or the village of Gevrey, to the more northern side of this swath of Grand Cru that we do see, these vineyards that each have their own individual AOC. This kind of darker maroon, pinkish color. The more taupe that we have here are Premier Crus. Premier Crus are technically part of the AOC village or village level, but with their own named vineyard or named plot of land. So we'll get a little bit more into that. And then you can also make just Gevrey-Chambertin wine from any of the sort of AOC commune area. And this includes the village of Brochon as well. Brochon is not authorized to release any wines under its own AOC. So any of the wines or vineyards that are affiliated with Brochon can actually be released under the Gevrey-Chambertin name. As we move down to this next photo, you can see this hillside, all of these vineyards. And here's where we begin to see the Grand Cru. And we'll see a map of many more of these as we go along. A visual aid is always wonderful, I think, to have. But to orient ourselves, you know, this way is going to the north. Here we're going to the south. Here we have Corkbuzz, which is a Premier Cru that we'll discuss a little bit later on. And then you have the village line separating the village of Maurice Saint-Denis. And the Grand Cru associated with Maurice Saint-Denis is Clos Saint-Denis, which also surrounds the Corkbuzz, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's a road that runs through these 9 Grand Cru. Do you see 8 listed here? We're going to talk about that in a second too. Gevrey-Chambertin and Mazoyer are 2 separate Grand Crus, but they're oftentimes considered collectively. So you might have heard before that there are 32 Grand Crus total in Burgundy, or you might have heard, or you have also heard, that there are 33 Grand Crus total in Burgundy. The correct number is 33 because Charmes and Mazoyer both have their own AOC. So they are not collectively one Grand Cru. They're 2 separate Grand Crus with their own AOC status. So You might also hear that there are 8 Grand Crus in Gevrey-Chambertin, but the actual number is 9. And when you hear that 8 or you hear that 32, it's because some people are considering Charmes and Mazoyer collectively. And you'll find out why. It will make sense, I promise. Now, the upper 5 Grand Crus are considered to be kind of like the top tier, like, you know, Grand Cru A. The bottom 4, Charmes, Mazoyer, Griot, Chapelle, are sort of considered like the class B Grand Cru. Now, we're always going to look at producer first, right? We're going to say, well, this is Rousseau Charmes Chambertin, so it must be good, and it will be. But just to consider, when you're looking at the pricing of these Grand Cru wines coming from Gevrey-Chambertin, there's a difference in the pricing of Les Chambertin, the granddaddy of them all, right? And Griot Chambertin. So, you know, please, as I mentioned, stop me if we do have any questions. So as we're zooming in a little bit closer here, we can also see that the forest at the top of the slope, this has a big impact on Le Trissier, especially Rouchottes over here, closer to the north, and then the northern part of Chambertin and Chambertin-Clos de Bez. So the northern parts of these slopes of these Grand Crus will be a little bit different than what we might find in the southern parts of these Grand Crus. And I think it's interesting that we'll start to look at the concept of the terroir within each of these Grand Crus and maybe even the Premier Crus, because the idea of terroir, which is of course the French term that says that the growing environment of the grapevine makes it singular, right? Makes it only like its own thing. And this idea can be, I mean, most of us agree with the concept of terroir, right? That the growing environment affects the agricultural product that comes from it. I've said this before, we understand that an orange grown in Florida is going to be better than an orange grown in New York, right? Because of that concept of climate, maybe what type of soil we have, how much warmth we're getting. We understand that certain, you know, and then that's also why we have place names for, you know, Vidalia onion, right? For San Marzano tomatoes, anything that you hear of these certain food products that have a specific place associated with them, they have that place associated with them because it's been proven that it becomes some of the best coming from whatever the conditions of that place are. So we don't really contest the idea that terroir exists, right? But sometimes the idea of terroir is contested because if Les Chambertin has its own terroir as a Grand Cru, then why don't all wine coming from Les Chambertin taste the same, right? So we'll really discuss that these individual holdings have a lot to do with where they are within these vineyards. We're not going to talk about exactly where everything is, but just to understand the concept of this. And also, of course, the producer style. Who's making the wine? What decisions are they making in the vineyard that's affecting how those wines are grown, even if they're all being grown in Clos de Bez? And then once those grapes are in the cellar, how do they get from the vineyard to the cellar, right? And then once they're there, what are the decisions that are made that affect the finished style of the wine? So the human element in winemaking is incredibly important, even in, and maybe especially in Burgundy. So you can see the top of the hill. As we're moving down, we definitely are seeing heavier soils. The soils are, you can't really see, but this is a slope, right? Up towards the top, we have poorer soils. We're closer to the mother rock of limestone, where things will hardly even grow in some of this mother rock where it's exposed. We have stonier soils, better drainage, and then we'll talk about how the sun affects some of these upper parts too. And as we move into Griot, Chapelle, and especially Mazoyer, as you can see, we come closer and closer to the road. These are less on a slope because of erosion and drainage. The soils do become denser and heavier in these areas, and that affects the quality and also the structure of the wine. Zooming in further. So here you see again, kind of this construct of these Grand Crus. These are the individual producer holdings in the Grand Crus and then outside. So this one only showed the outlines of the Grand Crus, but of course we're talking about the Premier Crus. We would have up here, we have Bel Air, which is part Premier Cru and part village level. We'll talk about that. But you can see now how fragmented these vineyards really are. I mean, look at Côte, like these teeny tiny little parcels in these areas. And in Chambertin, you know, how much wine some of these winemakers are producing from these different areas. So it can be, you know, kind of a cool thing to look at. How do we organize the appellations in Burgundy? Everybody on this call knows, but for some of those that might be joining or watching later, we're not going to talk a ton about the appellation system or the history. We're going to kind of gloss over that. Hopefully you'll get a chance to watch our Burgundy Basics video, which will fill you in on a lot. But essentially the appellation system protects the consumer, it protects us, understanding that what we purchase and it says on the label is what we're receiving in the bottle, and that the price that we're paying for that should more or less correspond with the quality. Now the AOC system is not actually just a system for quality. It's actually a control of like how and what goes into the bottle. And quality is associated with that when we're regulating how these wines can be made, how these grapes can be grown as we become more specific in the appellation, right? Regulating where the grapes themselves can come from, what grape we can use. So we already know that we're talking about a region, Gevrey-Chambertin can only produce Pinot Noir if you're using the village, any of the villages Grand Crus or lieu-dits or Premier Crus on the label, right? You can't produce anything else and call it Gevrey-Chambertin. So really, when we're talking about the organization of appellation, you know, Bourgogne doesn't really affect the class that we're talking about tonight. Something that might be important is you might think that Fourier, located in Gevrey-Chambertin, so if he's releasing a Bourgogne level old vine wine, it's probably from grapes primarily coming from Gevrey-Chambertin, right? You're not guaranteeing it with what's on the label. And when we think about the AOC system, the terminology that's on the label is the lowest denomination of what could be in that bottle. Meaning that, of course, we could choose to declassify village level wine from Gevrey-Chambertin and label it as Bourgogne, right? Or Burgundy. We could choose to declassify Grand Cru or Premier Cru level wine and just call that Gevrey-Chambertin. For example, maybe you have a new planting of vines in your Chambertin vineyard and you want to use the fruit from those grapes, but you don't think that the vine is mature enough to really produce the Chambertin that you would want to put on a label. You might blend that Chambertin fruit with some of your just Gevrey-Chambertin lieu-dits holdings. So that wine can now only be called what the lowest denomination is, right? Gevrey-Chambertin. But it does technically have fruit that comes from a Grand Cru vineyard. How would we know this? Well, we wouldn't unless the producer told us or an importer or somebody else. But this is kind of the idea of understanding, right? So village is really where we're starting today. Gevrey-Chambertin, the village that we're talking about, all of the grapes, if you're putting Gevrey-Chambertin on the label, must come from vineyards that are associated with the village of Gevrey-Chambertin or the village of Bourgogne, which we mentioned before as well. This tends to be one of the most classic styles. It is relatively inexpensive for what you can get. You can drink some Domaine Bachelet coming from Gevrey-Chambertin. You could probably get a bottle for, you know, $60 or so. To be a really fantastic introduction into the style of this producer if you wanted to branch out and try some of Bachelet's higher end wines. So we're beginning to see the imprint of terroir at the village label. You might see at the village level, you might see a Gevrey-Chambertin labeled with the name of a lieu-dit or a named parcel of land also associated with Gevrey-Chambertin. Most producers, when we think about, again, that really kind of like fractured ownership, Most of these producers own or have long-term contracts where they farm the land in many different places in this village and many different places in Burgundy as well. So most of the producers, or many producers that we talk about today, also make wine in neighboring Maurice Saint-Denis, right? They also might make wine in Marsanne. You might have a producer who's based in Marsanne, but also making wine coming from Gevrey-Chambertin. So we'll discuss that. So it's unusual to see a lieu-dit on a village wine, or it's not as common as you might think. If you're like, well, if there's all these different lieu-dits, you know, then why aren't they putting it on the label? Because most are probably blending. And once you're blending, you don't get to hyphenate your different lieu-dits or your different Premier Crus. You can only just label it as Gevrey-Chambertin. Or if you're blending multiple Premier Crus, you can only label it as a Premier Cru wine, not, as you see listed here, a Premier Cru with the name of that specific Premier Cru on it. That's why, because Premier Crus are technically part of the AOC system of the village, that's why you can blend these different Premier Crus and just label it as Premier Cru. You can't do that when you get to the Grand Cru site. You can't say it's Chambertin and then also Rochot-Chambertin and then call it just Gevrey-Chambertin Grand Cru. It doesn't work because these Grand Crus are each their own AOC. Premier Cru wines are going to be more expensive than the village level wines, and Grand Cru wines are usually going to be more expensive than your Premier Cru wines, but there are exceptions, especially in this area where we have, again, 9 Grand Crus, sort of considered to be some better than the other. And this is not anywhere in the kind of French legislature on how good these different areas should be or not, but it's just kind of known after, you know, how many years have we had of the AOC system since the 1930s, that some of these Grand Crus are just better in quality than some of these others. Now, also, why are Bourgogne level wines so much less expensive? This constitutes about 50% of all of the wines made in Burgundy. There's a lot more of it available. Village level wines are around 30-something, 36 or so % of the wines made in Burgundy. Premier Cru wines are about 10%, and Grand Cru wines are about 2% of all of the wines produced. So this is really important to understand. Down here, you can see La Flève is actually located in the Côte de Nuits in the south, but you can see that a single producer will often produce not only a wine at each level, but also sometimes multiple Grand Crus, which we'll see with Rousseau here. And many of the producers in Gevrey produce multiple Grand Crus, so we're going to talk about that. Why is Burgundy the way it is? What makes it so fascinating and interesting and makes us want to spend hundreds of dollars on wine to explore this kind of liquid gold, right? I mean, why is this place called the Golden Slope? Is it because of the sunshine it gets, or because of the price that its wines can fetch on the market, especially the secondary market, right? Or is it really considered this kind of like liquid gold, right? So we know that the Roman Empire was here. Actually, the village of Gevrey, which we'll talk about, was founded on a former Roman village. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, the vineyards here were really developed by the Christian monasteries and the monks. So they developed a lot of these vineyards between the 500 and 1600. They built a lot of walls around these vineyards. That's why a clos is very common in Burgundy. Not all clos vineyards are still enclosed by a wall, but it's an homage to the idea that that was there. In the 1700s, the French Revolution took place in 1789. Following the French Revolution, when many of the holdings of the vineyard land in Burgundy were in the hands of either royalty or the church or wealthy landowners, this was taken from them. And it was put into the hands of the commoners in Burgundy. Shortly after this, in 1804, the Napoleonic Code took place, a civil code that ended the practice of primogeniture in Burgundy and in France in general, which was when the entire wealth of a family was passed down to the firstborn son. So the Napoleonic Code ended this practice, and actually in Europe, it really kind of followed everywhere post this, but it ended this practice of passing down the entire wealth to the firstborn son and ensured that all heirs or all male heirs would have their own slice of the pie, more or less. Well, in Burgundy, where we have this long history of the church, we have a long history of wine production and quality wine production. This meant that it was vineyards that were oftentimes being handed down. And this fractured the ownership of the vineyard to what you saw when we showed the Grand Cru maps and the different parcels of land that are owned by these different wineries. Now, of course, today we have the free market, so you can buy and you can sell vineyards and lands as you want. And this does happen today. You do see things selling, new producers taking over monopole. You see contracts that are expiring, and growers are choosing to start their own domain and make their own wine. So we see a lot of that today. But however, now just because you inherited some vineyard land doesn't necessarily mean that you know much about grape growing or wine making, right? So this can be a really big issue. So we had these fractured vineyards. We have more and more Burgundians that are starting to own these small tracts of land that either they don't know what to do with or are not economically viable. You can't actually make enough wine off of 2 rows of vines to sustain your family for a year, right? It's just not viable. So during this time, we see the rise of the négociants. Négociants are wineries or producers who purchase either just grapes, or they might purchase wine or juice that's being made into wine or finished wine, and then they sell it under their own label. So we know a lot of the négociants, we know Jadot, we know Fabergé, right? But in the 1930s, a lot of these growers who were selling their grapes to these larger négociants, or a lot of these wineries began deciding that they wanted to start to bottle their own wine. So in the 1930s, we really begin to see the rise of domain bottling. So oftentimes in Burgundy, you see domain before the name of the winery. And they're essentially telling you that not only do they grow their own grapes, but then they make their own wine from those grapes. And this is usually an indication of quality. Not always, it's not the only indication of quality, because there are négociants who make fantastic wines. And there's a lot of domains who have négociant projects. And there's a lot of négociants who actually own their own vineyards, like Jadot and Fabergé. So important to understand as well. So it's not the only precursor for quality in Burgundy, but if you do see the term domain, you know that there is a certain level of control over how the grapes are grown, and then the resulting wine is made from those grapes. So soil climate exposure, continental climate, cold winters, pretty honestly warm summers. We're on a fault line which pushed up this golden slope. We have a lot of limestone soil. Pinot Noir really loves this limestone. The Grand and Premier Crus tend to lie at the mid slope of this slope itself, of this kind of fault line, where the soil drains well, and we see the luminosity really increased here. Marl, this higher clay content that you might see, is really fantastic for these Chardonnays when we get to talking about that. But there's a lot of issues with weather here, especially during the spring when the bud break is happening, and then in the fall when the harvest is taking place. And these are among some of the most sensitive times for the grape and for the vine itself. And we have a lot of hazards with this. I mean, you might see, you have like 12, 13, 14, all terrible years for frost and hail, right? And this also puts a lot of stress on the yield. We have much lower yields. The producers can make a lot less wine during these sort of difficult years. And that, again, increases the price of that Burgundy as well. So you can see up against the top, you usually have sort of a band of Premier Crus. You tend to see your Grand Crus here in the mid slope. This is not always entirely true, because in Gevrey, you do see a lot of them extend right up to the slope. Then you tend to have your Premier Crus again on the bottom side, which we do see in Gevrey, of the Grand Crus. And then as we move down towards the road, as we move down towards the village, you usually have a gentler slope or flatter land. These are just kind of your generic either village or wines that will go into generic Burgundy. without a village name itself. So how is Gevrey different? So we mentioned already, based on a Roman settlement, exceptional wines from this area have been cited from near Dijon as far back as the 6th century. In fact, in 2009, they discovered 27 rows of vines, probably dating back to the 1st century, which is pretty cool. Côte is the first appearance of what we consider to be a modern Grand Cru vineyard. Chambertin Côte was a gift from the Duke Amalgaire of Burgundy to the monks of the Abbey of Bez during this time, 630, so we can trace it back to then. And also, importantly, Gevrey was the first village to decide to rename itself by adding the suffix of its most famous vineyard in 1847, which was Chambertin. So this was approved by the king at the time. He said yes, Gevrey became Gevrey-Chambertin, and many of the other villages in Burgundy followed suit. So there's a couple of reasons for this, right? One is that the vineyards first began to be classified in Burgundy in the 1800s, although the appellation system didn't come around until the 1930s, but we understood that there were superior and inferior tracts of land within this region, right? So once we begin classifying these different kind of vineyard sites, the villages began to append the name of their most famous vineyard. Now this does a couple of different things. One, it can be a little confusing to the consumer because, you know, somebody might say, I had the best Chambertin last night. And you might be like, wow, like who did you have this from? You know, who did you get the Chambertin from? And did you get Rousseau, like one of the best producers? And they might say, no, I had it was, you know, a Gevrey-Chambertin village wine. Okay, well, that's wonderful. That wine probably delicious, but it's just not quite the same as a Chambertin Grand Cru wine. So it can be a little confusing. But one thing that it does do is that the producers that might be outside of the boundaries of these Grand Crus or Premier Crus, it gives them some marketability, right? It gives them an opportunity to kind of associate themselves with these grander vineyards and have an opportunity to sell their wines as well. This is the Côte d'Ivoire's largest appellation, 400 hectares, not including the Grand Cru. With the Grand Cru, it's about 455 hectares. And as we know, we're only talking about Pinot Noir. And this is, you know, the fact that it's one grape is what really gives us the opportunity to explore this sense of terroir, right? We're not talking about growing Pinot Noir in one spot and Syrah in another, and then trying to compare those nuances. You know, probably the idea that Burgundy evolved into almost this monoculture of just Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is because when the monks were farming these vineyards, when they were making their notes and noticing the differences in these vineyard plots and sites, they really wanted to explore this, and they honed in on these two grape varieties that seemed to be the best looking glass into this terroir. Now, the style of Gevrey-Chambertin is bolder. The classic style is solid. It tends to be more powerful. These are structured wines. They have a darker fruit profile for the wines of Burgundy. Depending on which Grand Cru or where you are, they can be a little wild and animalistic sometimes. They tend to be tannic and austere in their use, especially if we're talking about the Grand Crus or the Premier Crus. But these are some of the most age-worthy examples of Pinot Noir in all of Burgundy, which is really important. Now, of course, we talked about the idea of the human element and producers. You know, it's not just enough that you have, of course, the 2,000 years of history of grape growing in Burgundy, but you do have this this cultural know-how that's been passed down for generations and centuries from family member to family member about how to best care for these individual sites. If you have a site that's been within the family for decades or even a century, you know, you've really passed down a lot of this cultural knowledge about how to coax the best expression from the grape that you have there. And the best expression can change, you know, based on who the next generation that takes over the winery, right? In the 80s and 90s, we tended to see styles of Gevrey-Chambertin that were produced in a more New World style. And I mean, you know, a lot of cold soaking to extract color. We were completely destemming during these times to add less tannin and make the wine softer and a little bit plusher. We were seeing higher levels of new oak. That were adding a second layer of spice and vanilla to the wines themselves as well. Also, what we're doing in the vineyard, right? Are we green harvesting? Are we leaf plucking? Are we using mechanical versus manual harvesting? And when are we harvesting? Are we harvesting on the earlier side to express acidity, or are we harvesting on the later side to have a little bit more of a plush and ripe fruit character? Now, the decision to pick is not always based on the quality of how ripe you want your grape to be. Oftentimes, the hand of the farmer or the vigneron is forced in Burgundy to pick before the rains. So obviously, I think too, there's all sorts of things that we can talk about, but you know, plowing has been a big issue recently, and there's people that are really for it and people that are really against it. But one thing that plowing does do is it breaks up and cuts off the surface roots of the vine so that the roots have to dig deeper for water. But also when it does rain, the grapes don't swell quite as much. So it's kind of an important decision for these winemakers to balance possible underripeness or a less riper style than you might want with what might become diluted or even ruined grapes if the grape bursts and disease gets in. Because the appellation is so large, the village wines especially can be variable. So this is why we're going to look at so many producers. We're going to go through them pretty quickly because, as I said earlier, we're going to give you all of this information. So a lieu-dit is a named parcel of land. It's you know, not as common to see lieu-dits on a village or village level of wine. The reason for this is, as I mentioned, the parcels are so small that typically you don't have enough, you know, grapes or vines in a single parcel to always make a single lieu-dit wine. So most of the time you'll blend those and release that as your Gevrey-Chambertin village style wine. Now, a lot of the kind of village lieu-dits, and these lieu-dits, every piece of land in France and in Burgundy is named. And a lot of this is for political and taxation reasons, but it gives us, it's really useful in the world of wine when we can actually name these plots of land so we can begin to understand these nuances and these differences, right? So we have the Côme de Lavaux, and in Burgundy, although we talk about this kind of golden slope, there's a lot of traverse, you know, kind of valleys and combes that run through this. And, you know, over time, geologically, a lot of alluvial soils have washed down from these combes, and this is actually ensured on some of these lower vineyards some better quality, and these kind of sometimes a little bit more rocky or sort of soils or pebbly soils that have washed down. In 2002, and this is pretty rare that this happened, there was a lot of vineyards that were actually beneath the road, the D974, that were demoted from the appellation. So they were looking to increase the quality. They demoted a lot of these vineyards or these lieu-dits that they thought were not worthy of the Gevrey-Chambertin appellation name. Those wines can be released as just Bourgogne level only. And the ones that remained that didn't get cut were really in this cone dejection, this alluvial runoff that we see. So we have some village vineyards, Bel Air, Boisserie, Clopria, and La Romanie, you've seen that name somewhere else, right? That are partly classified as Premier Cru. So you might see these vineyards that are Premier Cru, but also village level. And then you see a list of some of these village level lieu-dits as well. I really like Champchini's. Joseph Roti is a favorite producer of mine coming from the area. So every now and then I've highlighted or put in bold a couple of things that I want to remember to make a note about. And that's really the only reason. So Champchini's is just beneath Charm and makes some really great village level lieu-dit style wines. And this it was really a lieu-dit that was made famous by Joseph Roti. So Premier Cru vineyards, 84 hectares, 26 Premier Crus in total. There are two main groups. We have one group that is kind of the Coast St. Jacques, which we'll talk about. Another one that is just below and then right to the north that pretty much abut the Grand Cru. The Coast St. Jacques did not abut the Grand Cru. And then we have two singletons, Corkbuzz and Bel-Air. These are both next to a Grand Cru vineyard, but they're not sort of in a swath of Premier Cru vineyards like many of these others. So the first one, as I mentioned, next to the 9 Grand Crus. Many of these are below Chapelle and Mazis. Some are in the north, and some of them are just below where we see Chapelle, Griot, as I mentioned before. The second group, the Côte de Nuits, this is where you see sort of the top tier Premier Cru. Clos St. Jacques is released at a higher price than some of the Grand Cru vineyards that you'll see, even though it's only a Premier Cru, and we'll talk about why that is. So these are really kind of a group of superior Premier Cru: Clos St. Jacques, Lavaux, Estournel, and Casatier, which we're going to talk about. They're a little bit closer to the boundary with Brochon. This will make sense in a moment. And then you have a list of your 26 Premier Cru vineyards down here as well. So, all right, how are we doing? A lot to discuss. And I hope it's not too boring too, because I'm like, gosh, how do I make this like, tour of Gevrey-Chambertin and just saying vineyard names and then talking about producers interesting, right? So I hope that we can do some of that. So let's take a look at where we are. So again, we're talking about the 9 Grand Crus, all right next to each other, La Trissière and Mazis are kind of like the bookends of the two heartland of the Grand Cru area, right? Chambertin and Chambertin-Clos de Bez. Chambertin and Chambertin-Clos de Bez are the only Grand Crus where Chambertin is the only or the first part of the Grand Cru. All of the other Grand Crus include the name Chambertin, but it's hyphenated at the end. So the point was is that they wanted to make sure that La Trissière Chambertin, Charme Chambertin, Rochot Chambertin, Mazis Chambertin, Mazoyer Chambertin, Griot Chambertin, Chapelle Chambertin. They wanted to ensure that the name would be hyphenated, Chambertin would be hyphenated at the end to not confuse it with the best Grand Cru of the 9, which is Chambertin, and then second to that, Chambertin-Clos de Bez, the oldest known vineyard really in Burgundy. You can see in the little bit of the lighter, more salmon color, the swath of Premier Cru that we were just discussing. So Corkbuzz, we're going to talk about in a second, really important. Bel-Air, very important. Casatier, very important. And Le Clos St. Jacques, also very important. Because there's so many Grand Crus, we can't really discuss every Premier Cru, unfortunately. In some of the other villages, we'll get to talk about more Premier Crus, but there are just so many here for 1 hour. And then you can see these lieu-dits. Of course, again, many of these are going to be blended together. Many of these Premier Crus are blended together. And there are some exceptions for Grand Crus that can be blended as well. I know you're like, Amber, you told us that you can't ever do that at all. But in Burgundy, there's always an exception to the rule. Literally, there's an exception to every rule, right? A lot of things have been grandfathered in or have been petitioned, or sometimes just because the law says you can't do something or you have to do it a certain way doesn't always mean that a producer follows that law, right? Sometimes you, ask forgiveness later, right, is the term. So let's talk about Bel-Air and Corkbuzz first. These are the 2 Premier Crus that are the singleton. So they're not located in the group or the swath of other Premier Crus, like we'll talk about. Bel-Air is adjacent to Rochot and Clos de Bez. It's sitting just above Clos de Bez. It suffered a lot during phylloxera, and it really wasn't cleared and replanted until the 1960s. So the part that's directly adjacent to Clos de Bez is classified as Premier Cru. The upper part is actually classified as village level. So how would you tell this apart, right? Your village level, Bel-Air, will not have the term Premier Cru written out as Premier Cru, or as you see here, the number 1 ER Cru. So if you just see Gevrey-Chambertin, Bel-Air without Premier Cru or 1 ER Cru, that's just a village level lieu-dits wine. If you see Premier Cru on the label, they're telling you it's coming from that part of the vineyard that's classified as Premier Cru. We're high up on the slope. Anytime you're higher on the slope, you have the effect of the forest. You have the effect of these cones with this kind of cooler air that's coming down and funneling through, and you're going to have thinner topsoil. So anything right at the top, like Bel Air, going to have a lot of acidity, right? We're going to get a lot more kind of fresh and tart fruit flavors. Producers well known in this area would be Topinot Merm, which are not actually located within Gevrey-Chambertin. So I'm not going to, when we start talking about the Grand Crus, many of the producers in the Grand Crus also make wine in Grand Crus outside of Gevrey-Chambertin, right? In Champeaux or in Maury. We're going to talk about that, but I didn't include it in this presentation since we're distinctly talking about Gevrey. But there are also producers outside of Gevrey that are making wine in Gevrey as well. So you'll see that sometimes. If you're like, I didn't think Topinot Merm within Gevrey-Chambertin, the winery itself is not. Do they make wine in Bel Air? Yes, they do. Philippe Charlopin, Vougerie make the village style wine coming from Bel Air. Corkbuzz is a fascinating Premier Cru. It's at the extreme southern end. It is the only Premier Cru in Burgundy that's surrounded on all four sides by Grand Cru. So it's surrounded by not only La Trissière and Mazoyer-Chambertin, located in Gevrey-Chambertin, but it's also surrounded on the other side by Clos Saint-Denis, the Grand Cru located in Maury Saint-Denis. So, you know, sometimes it's not really understand why some of these Premier Crus were necessarily left out of the Grand Cru classification. So it could have been political. At the time of classification, all of the producers of Corkbuzz were actually from Maury Saint-Denis. So because politically, the vineyard is part of Gevrey-Chambertin, they might not have submitted it for Grand Cru approval. It has a slight depression compared to its neighbors. So it's in a little bit of a dip by comparison to the Grand Crus around it. And the soils are a little bit heavier and they're slightly wetter. So this could have had a lot to do with why Corkbuzz itself was not included for Grand Cru classification, but instead for Premier Cru. And, you know, when we're thinking about in this time of global warming, and this is going to be an interesting conversation with the Grand Crus, you know, when Grand Crus all over France or Cru vineyards or the top vineyards in each appellation were singled out during the beginning of the kind of different classifications and the building of the AOC system in France, it would usually given to the places where the grapes ripen best, right? And so with global warming, that's definitely changing. So Corkbuzz today might be considered a Grand Cru vineyard with a little bit of the warmer vintages as well. Marchand Frere, Rossignol Trappé, and Domaine Trappé, we're going to talk about both of those, are three producers from Gevrey that you'll see. And then you also see a lot of Maury Saint-Denis producers, Perrier, Amiot, Arlaud, Beaumont, Dujac, and Georges Lignier, who we're going to try a wine from tonight. So Clos Saint-Jacques, we're going to talk about these two Premier Crus and move on to the Grand Cru. So Clos Saint-Jacques is considered to be almost of mythical Grand Cru status. The wines that it produces can be really fantastic. This was actually once a stopping point on the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Through this area, it's perfectly situated. It's south and east exposures, just like the Grand Cru. It makes fantastic style of wine. The soils are perfect, but it doesn't merit Grand Cru status. So again, just kind of like the idea of Corkbuzz, there's a couple of reasonings for this. One is just because simply it's separated boundary-wise from the swath of Grand Cru, so it might not have been included because of that. But it's also said that the owner at the time of the classification of the Grand Crus was very difficult to work with. And during this sort of city or village council meeting about the vineyard that it was going to submit for Grand Cru status, the owner at the time lit up a cigarette. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. He was told he had to go outside and leave the meeting. And during this time, they decided not to submit, because it was a monopole holding of his at the time, any of Clos Saint-Jacques for Grand Cru status. So This is a social legend, is it right? I really don't know, but it might be because his granddaughter produces wine in Gevrey-Chambertin today. Oh, sorry, not his granddaughter, the granddaughter of one of the workers that worked for him at that time. So there's only 5 producers here: Rousseau, Jadot, the Negociant, Fourier, Sylvie Esmonin, and Bruno Claire, who's actually located in Marcenay, but we're going to talk about him for a second. So they have 5 strips that run top to bottom, more or less, which is really interesting to see, because rather than having some producers who are at the top of the slope, they're at the bottom of the, or the bottom of the slope, they all have a little slice of each, which is really interesting. So this kind of perfect exposure makes Clos St. Jacques a very complete wine. They say it has a lot of structure, beautiful weight, and incredible complexity as well. Cazetier is just adjacent, a little bit larger than we see in Clos St. Jacques, also on a steep slope facing due east. A lot of small stones in the vineyard, they reflect heat, they really aid in drainage. It's known for a very fine, elegant, and complex wine. They tend to be lighter in color, as do many of the wine coming from some of the upper slopes. But it's always said that it has a lot of precision, intellectual appeal. It's very vinously satisfying. Sorry, that's a typo there. It's supposed to say vinous, like, you know, like wine. Sorry about that. Bruno Claire is a really cool producer because even though he's based in Marcenay, he makes wine from both Cazetier and from Clos St. Jacques. Both of these sites that he owns were planted by Bernard Claire, so I think it was his grandfather. They were planted within 1 year of each other. They were planted on the same rootstock and from the same clone. So this is an example because he makes these wines from Clos St. Jacques and Cazetier that are the same clone, same rootstock, planted in the same year. This is a really great opportunity to see terroir. Although they do come from slightly different parts of the slope in these 2 vineyards, but it's a really interesting opportunity that you might not find elsewhere, even if you're comparing all of Rousseau's Grand Crus. When were those vines planted, right? How were they farmed before Rousseau took them over? So forth and so forth. Let's talk about some Grand Crus. I don't want to keep you too late, so if you need to jump off, please feel free, but you know, we're gonna have all this information, so I think we can go through it kind of quickly. We already know that it's divided via the route de Grand Cru, the country road that runs parallel to the D974, divides it into the 2 sections. West of the road, the shallower soil, higher grade, Mazis, Ruchot, Chambertin, Clos de Bez, Chambertin, and Le Truffier. So they all share the same aspect and a higher elevation. The soils are mostly thinner. We have a few exceptions. They are tinted a little bit red on the lower slopes, and these are the more superior Grand Crus. East of the road, on a gentler slope, the Grand Crus have a lighter complexity to them. And then the more prestigious neighbors, they tend to have a little bit heavier soils, a little bit more nutrient-rich soils, which might not be quite as good for the wines themselves. So Chambertin, we already know, the grand one, the heartland of Gevrey-Chambertin itself, along with its neighbor Clos de Bez. These are really the regal pair of the village. Chambertin does have some cooler breezes that come down from the Côme Grissard, which are here. These styles are less forthcoming than what you might find in Clos de Bez, but they're powerful and they need time to age. They tend to lack a little bit of finesse in their youth, but they're really styles of wine that are kind of built as powerhouses to age and develop in the bottle. And when Burgundy develops in the bottle, it really creates this gorgeous, beautiful characteristic of truffle and earth and fruit and flowers. I mean, almost like a potpourri as well. Armand Rousseau is the top producer. And this is also, the producers here are organized by how much land they own in each vineyard. So Rousseau, Jean-Louis Trappé, Camus, Rossignol Trappé, which we'll talk about, Jacques Prière, Louis Latour, Leroy, Pierre Damoy, sorry, that should be one word, Gevrey-Chambertin, who has a lot of Grand Cru vineyards, the wines are okay. They don't tend to be the best, unfortunately. But like Charles-Pin, we'll talk about. Domaine Ponceau is located further south, but they also make wine here. Laurent Ponceau also makes wines. It's the elected family. Dugat P is really important. Dujac from Maurice Saint Denis makes wine here. Chambertin Clos de Bez, we know it's the oldest climat. Producers may choose to label their Clos de Bez wines as Chambertin only. This actually rarely happens, though. It's not very common. You might have producers that have plots of land in both Chambertin and Chambertin Clos de Bez, and if they choose to blend those rather than vinifying separately, they can label that wine as Chambertin. Again, this is one of those exceptions. Clos de Bez is typically more open and upfront. It tends to be more perfumed and accessible. This is the wine that will be ready a little bit younger than what you might find for Chambertin. What else could I tell you? So you see, some really interesting facts about the vineyard itself here. Pierre Damoy is one of the largest owners. You see lots of pictures of a little sort of white house in the vineyard with Pierre Damoy on it, saying Chambertin Clos de Bez. That's the parcel that does belong to him. He owns the most of Clos de Bez. Rousseau, Drouin Larose, Favelet make great wine coming from here as well. Bruno Claire, Jadot is here also. Dujac's also making wine. Joseph Durhan also in the area making wine here. Gevrey-Chambertin, and sorry, you probably realized that like I have little circles around the different Grand Crus here as you're looking at it. Just over 9 hectares. So it's one of the bookends at the northern end of the swath of Grand Cru, close to the village. There are 2 distinct parts of Mazis, and anytime you see this kind of slash mark, it's because there are two spellings that you might see on a label. This is also one of the really confusing things about Burgundy, but sometimes you see producers that label it with a different spelling, even for the same place. So there's 2 parts. Mazi O sits on the same rock formation, the same kind of mother rock as Clos de Bez. And it's a little bit superior to the lower part, Mazi Ba, which is on a slightly deeper soil. The wines are also known for their really firmer structure. They tend to be more wild. They have kind of an herbal element to them as well, especially coming from the more superior northern part. Joseph Favelet makes some really fantastic wine coming from here. Armand Rousseau, of course, in the area making fantastic wine. And you see there's quite a few producers in this area. In some of the Grand Crus, we don't have very many at all, or some of the Premier Crus. So it's really nice to see that we have a couple of these Grand Crus that are seeing multiple producers. La Trissière is the other bookend, right? Now we're at the southern part of the northern swath of Grand Crus. Distinguished as a vineyard dates back to 1508, separated from the Grand Cru, the Maurice Saint Denis, from Clos Saint Denis, just by Les Combats, which we talked about as well. The term comes from Latin, meaning nothing much. It talks about how impoverished the soils really are here. It's a little bit deeper than some of the Gevrey-Chambertin Grand Crus, but it does give us this really interesting style of wine that has kind of a rich and pure fruit, but develops a lot of kind of earth and topsoil and potting soil characteristics with age as well, which can be really nice. Probably because you have a combination of those slightly deeper soils, but also that kind of cooling influence that's coming from the Combe Grissard right above us as well. Domaine Leroy is here. Domaine Simon Bise, which I love. So Simon Bise is one of my favorite producers. Chisa Bise is actually the winemaker now, and she has this land that used to be farmed by Ponceau, but is not anymore. So she's taken over, but she's based in the village of Savigny-le-Bon in the Côte de Nuits, which is really cool that she's also up here making wine in La Trissière. Gevrey-Chambertin, going back more closer to the north side, just above Mazis-Chambertin. This is the steepest and highest in elevation of all of the Gevrey Grand Cru. So even though it's quite small, it's just over 3 hectares, it's also divided into an upper and lower part. And the upper part, which is called Clos des Rocheux, it belong entirely to the Rousseau family. So they're the only ones making wine. The other 27 separate parcels in the lower part are shared by 8 owners, which you see mentioned down here as well. Frederic Edmonin, the cousin to Sylvie, who we'll be talking about, Christophe Roumier, Trappé is here as well. Producers coming from Marseillais. The name is a corruption of Little Rock, which is really an homage to the really infertile soils here as well. So it gives us a lot of subtle nuances, and we really prize that over maybe the kind of weight that you might get out of some of the others. Chapelle-Chambertin, also divided into 2 lieu-dits, Chapelle and Les Guillemets, meaning the twins, takes its name from a chapel that was here built in 1155, destroyed in 1830 in one of France's kind of regular bouts with revolution in this area as well. The topsoil here is sparse. So because of this, any of these areas where we talk about really, really sparse topsoil, and even though that's most of them, griots, Chapelle, Le Trissier, like these can really suffer in warmer years. So we talked about the concept of global warming earlier, and this can have a really big effect on these wines in the upcoming years. So some of these topsoils that are thinner, that don't retain as much water or moisture, will do much better in the wetter, cooler years than some of the vineyards with the topsoil that, that has, sorry, I forget how I was putting it. So this will do better in warmer, wetter years because it has this really thin topsoil that doesn't retain any moisture, versus some of these others that have a little bit of a richer topsoil, right? So they tend to be a little lighter in character and color. You have Ponceau, Jean-Louis Trappé is here, Rossignol Trappé, also cousin, Jadot, Cécile Tremblay, which we're going to talk about, and also Claude Duguay. Gevrey-Chambertin, also this kind of low-lying amphitheater. So you have these 2 wings that sort of encompass this flatter center. The soils are less compact than Charmes, but the roots are able to sort of dig down and descend below these topsoils, which can be really also notoriously shallow, as I mentioned, can also be very dry, much like Chapelle in a much more dry year. They tend to be the lightest wines of Gevrey, of all the Grand Crus, but they have a lot of perfume to them. Oftentimes can be very floral, a lot of peony and cherry characteristics. Griot has a ton of star producers, and this is probably one of the reasons that the quality and the reputation of the vineyard of Griot really is saved. So Laurent Ponceau left his family winery. When he left his family winery, Domaine Ponceau, he took all of the long-term sharecropper agreements with him. So he was able to take over a lot of the vineyards that his family didn't own, but that they were working with for a very long time. Claude Duguay is here, Joseph Roti, which we talked about before, John Claude, now John Marie, his son, Fourier as well. Gevrey-Chambertin, moving a little bit further south, kind of considered to be one of the weakest of the Grand Crus, but again, producer is everything, right? Seraphine, Bachelet, Rodi, Rousseau can do really well here. Gevrey-Chambertin has a lot of producers, as you can see, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that Gevrey-Chambertin and Mazoyer-Chambertin, as we mentioned earlier, are usually collectively considered as one Grand Cru. So it's not, they're 2 separate Grand Crus. They can label as each other. All of Mazoyer can label itself as Charme, and most of Charme, but not quite all, can label itself as Mazoyer. As far as I know, there are no Charme producers who label their wine as Mazoyer, but almost all of Mazoyer labels their wines as Charme. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. We have a little bit more of a red topsoil here, some limestone pebbles. At its best, with the best producers, the wines are plump. They can be seductive. They have the power and the persistence of a Grand Cru, but not always the complexity. So you really do want to seek out the greater producers. You want to talk about Pierre Bourret. You want to talk about Rodi or Seraphine or Bachelet or Rousseau. really important to seek out these top producers in charms. I've had Rousseau Chambertin, and it was fantastic before. Mazoyer, collectively considered as part of charm. The entire area for charm in Mazoyer is over 30 hectares, so much, much larger. Why you see so many producers here. A lot of people really think that Mazoyer should be labeled separately because the style is actually quite different from charm. It's more wild. It tends to be kind of structured and tannic by comparison to what you find within charm. There are a few producers that will label their Mazoyer as Mazoyer. We have Dugat P, Perot Minot, Topinot Murm, and Camus. So they really think about labeling their wines because they have enough of each to do a Mazoyer and to do a charm, but not all producers are within that are. I can't keep you guys all night. I'm so sorry. Check and see how we're doing. So Clos de Bez is its own AOC. So it is actually its own appellation, although you can actually label it as Chambertin, but I don't think anybody really does because the vineyard itself, the name carries enough weight. One of those exceptions where it's like you could do it. This is also, advantageous to producers who don't have enough holdings in both Chambertin and Clos de Bez to make separate wines. So it's more advantageous to them if they only have a little bit that they can blend the two and release it as Chambertin. So that might be one of the reasons as well. Two of the oldest vineyards, they have a lot of producers in them. But we should ask somebody like Jasper Morris. I'm just going to breeze through these major producers because I'm going to send this information. So what I've kind of done here to just give you a little bit of background, Denis Bachelet, a fantastic producer, started his winery in 1981. He was born in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Spee. His father was from Gevrey-Chambertin, and his father was in Belgium with the Gevrey-Chambertin choir, met a Belgian girl, fell in love, got married, started his family. Denis came back to Burgundy in 1981. He would spend a lot of time with his grandparents here. This is where his father was from, and started his winery. His style is to destem his grapes. And then what I've done is I've listed not all of the wines that they produce, but some of the most important. So Chambertin, Old Vine, Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Corkbuzz. He produces a village level wine and then a Côte de Nuits village level wine. Charlot Pan like to use a lot of new oak on his wine. So if you like that kind of richer texture, a little bit more luscious and spiced from oak, you'd probably prefer the Charlot Pan style as well. They tend to be more immediately sumptuous while he's adding this oak. They don't age quite as well. Armand Rousseau, headed by Eric, the grandson of Armand today. He changed very little in the cellar. This is Gevrey-Chambertin's most prolific producer. Not only do they own the most land holding within Gevrey-Chambertin itself, the quality is fantastic. They have a long history of this area. Armand was at the forefront of domain bottling in the 1930s. Their Clos St. Jacques sells at the same price as Grand Cru wines. It's considered to be that good. And Armand's son, Charles, bought a huge slice of the Clos St. Jacques when it was up for sale from that monopole owner from before in 1959. The Grand Cru do see 100% new oak. Rousseau will give you an opportunity, if you have the budget, to taste these different Grand Crus side by side with more or less the same vinification on them. Chambertin, Clos de Bez, Rouchotes, Chambertin, and again, remember they own that upper part of Rouchotes. That really great part that's only owned by Rousseau themselves. Mazie, Chambertin, you can try Clos St. Jacques and Cavetier side by side. They also make just a village level wine as well. Pierre Damoy, really fantastic. Again, large owner in what we find in Clos de Bez. Claude Dugat, Bernard P. Dugat. These are related, they're family members. You see this a lot in Burgundy, right? The same names on several different bottling with a couple of hyphens because somebody got married and added somebody else's last name to it. We can talk about Sylvie Esmonin, one of the most prolific producers of Clos Saint Jacques. Her grandfather used to work for the Comte de Moucheron. This was the sole owner, the monopole owner of Clos Saint Jacques during the time that it was the appellation law was being drawn up within the area, and the Grand Crus were being decided on. She has pretty firm wine, but they have a lot of elegance to them as well. Jean-Marie Fourier took over from his father, Jean-Claude, in 1994. He worked in a lot of different places in the world. He spent a lot of time in Oregon, spent some time in California. His father had been working at the domain since he was 14. So I think it was probably quite the reprieve for him when Jean-Marie took over. Jean-Marie switched to 100% domain bottling. They're really, really known for quality. They work a lot with incredibly old vines. Pretty much all the vines that they work with are usually a minimum of 50 years old, if not more. But they're also making Griot. They're making, Clos Saint Jacques Premier Cru. You see a lot of fantastic styles, as well as village style wines and also the Bourgogne style wines as well. Denis Mortet doing some great things, veering away from his father's style, which was a little bit more weighty, to something more finesse and mineral. Rossignol Trappé and Domaine Trappé, they are cousins, they're related. The styles are a little bit different. Joseph Roti, run today by his son Philippe. These styles are kind of full and they tend to be fruity, but also very complex. I would give like a Joseph Roti wine to somebody that would usually maybe like a New World Pinot Noir drinker. Domaine Seraphine as well. These tend to be really powerful wines, also destemmed, and they use all new wood on most of their wines, except for the very basic Domaine Trappé. Jean-Louis is cousin to the Rossignol Trappés. The style is more succulent and kind of rounded, whereas the Rossignol Trappés are a little bit more precise. So it's interesting to see that difference in philosophy there. Cécile Tremblay, she is the great granddaughter of Edward Jaillet, who is the uncle to Henri Jaillet, one of the most important vignerons in Beaune Romani, which we'll talk about. She began taking back a lot of the parcels of land that her family had rented out starting in 2003. So she's taking a lot of these parcels back, making wine from them. She's really well known for her Chapelles-Chambertin. And of course, we have the negociants. Favalli and Jadot have a really big presence here, a little bit of Latour. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of great producers who are coming from outside of the village, but making wine within Gevrey. So Ponceau is important, Tapinot Merme, Roumier, Bruno Claire, Du Jacques, Prieur Roche are all important wineries, even Jacques Prieur coming all the way from Meursault. So I don't even know if you guys are still here. Sorry about that. So these wines that we're tasting today, I don't have them with me, so I'd love to hear what they kind of comments about these might be. So we're starting off with the Georges Lignier. We really wanted to provide wines that we thought offered incredible value for what we could get. Again, all Burgundy is expensive. Hubert Lignier is a really well-known winemaker coming from Burgundy. George is his cousin, but it's now his nephew Benoit who's taken over the winery itself. The style has evolved to be a little bit more delicate and subtle. Now, where this is in the context of Gevrey-Chambertin, which is one of the most fuller and more structured wines of Burgundy, right? But in that context, the style is a little bit more nuanced. We tend to be slightly more subtle. He worked with his uncle for more than a decade before assuming control of the winery and the vineyards in 2008. He really focuses on this aromatic concentration. One of the most important things that he really sees about these particular wines, even though he harvests a little bit later, he does destem his fruit and they tend to have a lot of balance to them. He harvests later just to make sure that he's getting the complexity in the fruit and in the aroma that he really wants. He uses all neutral or older oak barrels. He doesn't fine or filter. 2016 was a difficult year for growers. So it's important to really look for these producers that treated the grapes correctly in the vineyard. They did the appropriate amount of sorting that needed to be done to ensure that the less wine, but resulting wine that they made from these grapes would really represent their brand well. Pierre Bory, this is Gazetier Premier Cru 2009. This is an opportunity to see two totally different vintage conditions side by side. So 2016, not as plush and opulent as something like 9, 10, and 15, right? A little bit more restrained and reserved because of the conditions of the vintage. 2009, very long, dry growing season. No hail that caused damage, which is really surprising. The vintage shows a much riper, more plush fruit and body characteristic to it as well. Pierre Bory was originally from Dijon, from a family of lawyers, came to Gevrey and founded his winery in 1864. As I mentioned in other Burgundy classes, nepotism is alive in Burgundy, right? So we see the transfer of vineyards, and we see the transfer of wineries oftentimes to children and family members as well. His vineyard work is very pragmatic, organic driven, very restricted yield. He does use some whole clusters as well. And they also do human punch down. So rather than pumping over or using punch down sticks, somebody's actually getting into the vat and kind of gently and manually massaging the grapes as well. And also very little new oak. They really just purchase new barrels in order to replace barrels that are not up to standard anymore, can't hold wine anymore. So we see only about 10 to 20% new oak as well. They also have their own monopole called Clos de Justice, located inside the larger La Justice as well. Any thoughts if you have? I don't know if you guys have these wines open, but I know a couple of us have these. Thank you guys. There was a lot to go through. Sorry to keep you here for like ever. How are we doing?
Doing great. Yeah. Hey, Amber.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Yeah, the wines are really good. They're a lot less tannic than actually my impression of what Gevrey-Chambertin would be, because I just like I've had Louis Jadot's basic village Gevrey-Chambertin, for example, and I thought that was a lot more intense and needed a lot of time. These would do really well with time, but they're actually really drinkable now, and they're not super tannic, which I always thought was sort of the Gevrey thing.
Well, I think that's a great observation. And I think one is 2009. So, it's had, a 12-year-old wine from a warmer, riper vintage, which typically will age a little bit faster than a more classic vintage, right? And then the other one is 2016, which was also like just in general because of the weather, a little bit lighter, cooler. So when you think about those structural elements that allow the wine to age, you're not getting a lot of tannin influence in some of these cooler years, and then in some of these warmer years, you're not getting as much acidity influence. These kind of structural elements that allow the wine to age. I wish I had them here to taste. I just don't tonight. I'm at home, hiding from the rain. But thank you. I really appreciate your observations. Thank you, everyone. I don't want to keep you all night. I'm so sorry. Thanks for letting me talk about Gevrey-Chambertin for almost an hour and a half. Thank you.
One more really fast question. The first, I know you were talking about those two groups of Premier Crus, and then there are two Premier Crus that are not part of those groups. But for the two groups, one is the Côte Saint-Jacques. Does the other group have a general name, or is it just the ones that are closer to the Grand Crus?
I wrote it down. Let me look it up. I've got literally, I have been reading this book okay. So let me look it up because I can't remember that they do have kind of a name. The other one is known as the Côte Saint-Jacques, but I don't know that the other one has a general overarching name for that swath of Premier Crus. But I'll find out. I'll write it down so I don't forget. All right, thank you guys.
Thanks,
have a great night. Enjoy your evening. Venkato, looks sunny where you are. It's not like that here.
No, I think it's just the lighting, honestly. It's been raining and we had a thunderstorm. I'm up in Westchester, so it's not too different from you guys in New York City.
All right. Have a great night, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.